And welcome everybody to this holiday edition of At Lunch. So I can honestly say I've known today's guest practically since he was born. Jeremy Salamon is a celebrated chef who happens to be my cousin. Like my children, Jeremy is the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, and he's found a way to honor his heritage through his culinary talent. His restaurant, Augie's Counter, has been praised by The New Yorker, Eater, Time Out, The Infatuation, and more. Bon Appétit named Jeremy's restaurant as one of the 50 top new American restaurants of 2022. And just this week, the New York Times included Jeremy's Palacinta, that's a Hungarian crepe, as a top 25 dish of 2022. And I think we're going to share the recipe today. HarperCollins's Harvest Division is publishing Jeremy's story and recipes in a new book, which I think as soon as the holidays slow down, Jeremy's going to be working on it. So welcome, Jeremy Salamon.
Hi.
Hi, where are you?
I'm right here.
Nice to see you. So Jeremy, you're only 28 years old, but you've been cooking for a very long time. Yeah. So could you tell us how old you were when you started cooking and how that became your lifelong passion?
Yeah, I have been cooking since I was 10, 11. I would cook in the kitchen with my mother and my grandmothers, and eventually my grandmother Arlene got me my first job at a local country club. She harassed the chef, and I would scoop sorbets into martini glasses in the freezer when I was 11. And, you know, they pay me a little something. So that's really where it began, in a freezer with martini glasses and sorbet.
So child labor, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And could you tell everybody, I mean, I know there's probably a lot of family members on this Zoom today, but for the people who aren't a member of the family, tell us a little bit about where you grew up.
Yeah, so I grew up in Boca Raton, Florida, the Jewish motherland to some, and I had spent most of my life there until I was 18 years old, and it was a great childhood. I have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with Boca, but it is my hometown. And
so the Augie of Augie's Counter is the Hungarian grandmother.
Yes.
And Arlene, where was she from? Your mother, Robin's mother.
Yeah, my Nana Arlene, my mom's mom, she grew up in the Bronx, I believe. So originally from New York, but has Sephardic roots, so Jewish, Greek.
So let me ask you something. So you were this little kid, this was like a fun thing to do. You got to go to the country club and hold martini glasses. I hope you weren't drinking any martinis at the time, although who knows. No. But when did it kind of take hold that this was might be something you'd actually like to be or do when you grow up? Was there like this aha moment, or what was it? Was it something else?
Yeah, I tend to think about that often, especially as I get older. I really don't. It's always hard to pinpoint when that moment was. I was always a really curious eater. My parents exposed me to a lot of great food since an early age. However, I was terrible in restaurants. I never could sit still. I would scream. My mother had to actually make up like little games, trivia games, or guess what ingredient is in each dish on the menu, sort of thing. So it was instilled in me in a young age to enjoy food and to sit down and like it. And I was always really enamored with my grandmothers, both of them, and my mother's cooking and the way they would entertain for the family. And it almost felt like a bit of a superpower to be able to feed an entire family at the end of a day, or for a Jewish holiday, or Thanksgiving, all those sort of events. And that's I guess a superpower that I wanted to have for myself. So I think it's an accumulation of all these things.
Yeah, that's cool. Now, maybe I'm making this up, but I feel like when you were fairly young, you were on a cooking television show, or am I making that up in my mind?
I probably was. I did a couple things when I was like 12 or 13, when blogs were really cooking blogs were really taking off, and I didn't really have many friends, or I really didn't have any friends that cooked. I kind of turned to the internet and started a blog of my own that also had videos, and my friends who did video content filmed it, and one thing led to another, and eventually I wound up being on some morning shows because of it. It was a wild ride for a 13-year-old.
That is a wild ride. And so that sort of leads me to another question that I know now being the chef is kind of cool and trendy, and there are movies about the chefs and TV shows about chefs. But was it already becoming cool at the time you were growing up? So that would have been you were born in what, 94? So that would have been in the early 2000s by the time you started being interested in this. Was it already becoming like a thing to be a chef? Because I know that when I was growing up a long time before you, it probably would have been not cool. It would have been just something not even heard of.
Yeah, no, I feel like it was the early 2000s. It was just starting to take off, and the Food Network was really making a splash, and Giada De Laurentiis and Ina Garten and Paula Deen and all the Emeril Lagasse and all these people were really at the forefront of chefs now being the main attraction, not just the food. But it was still really uncommon for a kid to be cooking. And now there's kids cookbooks, there's Master Chef Junior, there's Chop Junior, there's Junior everything. And that was certainly not around when I started cooking.
But your friends, what did your friends think of it, or did they think of it?
Yeah, I mean, they stayed my friends. So I think I fed my friends really well. I would make dinners and lunches, and I know for school projects, I used to convince the teacher that instead of having to do a PowerPoint presentation or something like that, I would cook food that was related to the project. So of course, like, my fellow peers really loved me for that, because we'd eat in the middle of the day. And so I think I made out pretty well.
So, but then by the time you finished high school, you did apply and get into the Culinary Institute, right, in Hyde Park. So tell me about that, because I know you went and then you left.
Yeah,
I think I remember bumping into you and thinking, why aren't you in school? So tell us about that experience, because I think for a lot of people, that's sort of some kind of golden gateway.
Sure. And it still is. Maybe there's more conversation about it now, which is a good thing, but it was always instilled in me to go to culinary school. And I mean, my parents never pressured me to go to college. It was always do what you love or find yourself, and which I always loved that. But every kitchen I had worked in, there was always somebody that was telling me to go to the CIA, which was the Culinary Institute of America. And so that was what I was going to do. I was a very impressionable teen, and I got accepted, and left when I was 18, moved into a dorm up there and started cooking. And it didn't sit well with me learning how to cook out of a textbook. And that's just from a personal standpoint, from somebody who has cooked professionally and worked in kitchens, since a young age. I also worked in my parents, in my grandfather and my father's pharmacy. And so I was just always working, and I really missed that. And I thought, well, I could be paid to learn. And eventually one thing led to another. I was on an internship, and the chef had convinced me to stay. And so I dropped out of school, and it did well for me, I think. But
was that a hard, I mean, I'm asking because I think this is for people who have kids, or, I think that we always think you get on this track and you have to go through the track. And so was that, what did your parents think when you told them that? Was there a struggle within you to sort of step off this? Because that takes a lot of, I think a lot of self-confidence at that age to just go off, fly up into the unknown like that.
Yeah, I remember it being a pivotal shift in my thought process, and I felt like, I was going against the grain and not doing what was expected of me or what I thought that I wanted. And I was on an internship, and I really just my end goal was to always be in New York City and to work in New York City. And I was at the time working at a really esteemed restaurant that I'd really fallen in love with the food and had admired the chef. And I'm like, why am I going to leave this? And I actually reached out to, at the time there was a podcast and a radio show where I'd listened to a chef named Andrew Carmelini, who owns various restaurants in New York and on the East Coast. And he had a whole discussion about not going to school. So I actually sent an email to him and I was like, I'm very conflicted. I don't know what to do. And he had me meet with him, which is a whole other story, and wound up offering me a job at his restaurant.
Tell us that story. First of all, what restaurants does he own? And just tell us without, violating any confidences, but tell us.
Yeah, I really didn't expect an email to come back from him, but it did. And I went to meet him at his restaurant in Tribeca called Locanda Verde. He also owns a restaurant called The Dutch, which I believe is,
right by my house,
right by your house. And I was ushered into this private dining room, and it was a very long table, and it's attached to the Greenwich Hotel, which is owned by Robert De Niro. So it's very old and vintage and musty, and there's espresso everywhere and very Godfather like. And I remember sitting at a very long table in this private dining room, and I sat at one end and Andrew Carmelini sat on the on the other end, and he said, you should get up and come closer. And but I was handed an espresso, and we chatted for a while about why I may not need to go to school. And he brought up really great points that culinary school is not for everybody, but maybe it's great for sommelier in training, or maybe it's great for somebody that wants to own a hotel. It really varies per person. But it always kept coming up that, well, you could be paid to learn, which was what I was thinking anyways. And so, yeah, I accepted the job, and I moved over to Locanda Verde and spent a good while there working my way up the line and getting a very large kitchen experience, which was
just to elaborate, because I think for a lot of people, because there have been so many The Bear and all these shows that actually make it look very difficult. So when you say you got started, what was your first job? What were you actually doing
at Locanda Verde?
Yeah,
I think I was on garde-manger, which is the cold station. So you do salads or cold appetizers, and it was in front of a very large brick oven that was they would throw logs in it, and it was raging fire every night, so your back would just be drenched in sweat, but then you were plating things that came off of ice. It was a temperature disaster. And that's really how I started. And it was a big open kitchen, which I loved, and was one of the things that always stuck with me. And here at Augie's Counter at my restaurant, we have an open kitchen, and because I really admired the idea of being able to see where the food is going and being able to see people enjoy it and get immediate feedback. So but anyways, yes, garde-manger. I worked that station, and then I moved up to the grill and pasta, and it's certainly, there are a lot of comparisons to The Bear, which I don't know if people have seen it before, but the kitchen can be a not so glamorous place and a bit cutthroat, and hopefully that's changing. I really hope it is. And but it's certainly it's not what it was 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, and it's certainly not what it was like in the 90s or the 80s. That, I mean, it's definitely a different culture now, which is a good thing.
Yeah, well, I actually want to talk a little bit more about that because, I mean, I think a lot of people have, I guess Anthony Bourdain's book and then the TV documentary about him, I think, and, and God knows the competition, the children's show, all those, it always looks horrible, the meanness and the toughness. And, I do understand that it's a very high pressure business because, I just cooked dinner for friends the other night and I realized that this beautiful pie crust I'd made was made with rancid butter and I had to throw the whole thing out.
Oh, no.
So yeah, too long in the fridge. But, in a restaurant, you don't have a lot of time for a lot of that kind of mistakes. No. And so I guess the question is, I mean, from the time I've known you, you've always seemed like such a sweet person. and so are you Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Like, is there a different Jeremy behind the scenes? Because how do you navigate that world and, maintain the standard and everything else and yet try to, not be a monster?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. To be honest, I'm still figuring that out. The first thing I say to somebody coming on board here is we don't do the toxic stuff and we don't yell in this kitchen, and it's pretty much a one warning and you're done. And everyone's told the same thing. We try and talk things out here and have civil conversations because it does get really intense, and the heat, your back could be completely drenched and you're touching cold food in front of you, and there's a million different voices and things happening around you. And so it is a high stress environment, and it's really difficult to be able to remove yourself from that. And so I always tell staff, at least, that they can take a break, they can go outside, get a breath of fresh air, then come back, and we can always resolve the issue at the end of service. But I'm definitely not perfect. And it's hard. It's a hard balance to find, especially with the newer generation of cooks coming in. You're kind of walking this fine line of you'll get folks that are a little bit more inexperienced, and they see things on, because there's so much food media now, right? There's the TV shows and TikTok and Instagram, and I think there's this ideal utopia of what a kitchen is now, and the reality is we're not quite there yet, and we're still working on it. So it's hard, if that makes sense. It's a fully loaded question.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. But I guess the question that comes from that question is, and look, I'm a writer, so I spend most of my days in misery in front of a computer, and yet ask me and I'll say I wouldn't do anything else. It's what I love. Mm-hmm. But the work that you've chosen, and the really more than work, it's an avocation, obviously. But what is that like? What the physical labor, which is so intense, it's just physically taxing. Yeah. And then on top of it, we'll get to the ownership part in a little bit, but right now, just the physical reality of working in a kitchen. But what's the high part? What's the part that you think makes people want to do this? Or makes you want to do it, I guess.
Yeah, well, I guess putting the ownership aside for the moment, which is a completely new and thrilling territory that I'm navigating. From speaking personally, when I'm on the line, when I'm cooking, there is this rush, which maybe some other chefs and cooks can relate to, it's kind of like this very satisfying rush of doing 100 things at once, which sounds really crazy. And what kind of rush, or what kind of satisfaction do you get out of that? And I think it's just the type of person I enjoy doing a million things at once, which is a blessing and a curse. As I'm getting older, I know I'm not that old, but and I work out, I try and stay healthy and on top of it, but I do have back problems. I've, got leg problems. My wrists get really sore. So I'm definitely feeling it. And that's not the best part about this job, but that kind of thrill of figuring things out on the fly and but also creating food and being imaginative, and that's it's a package. It's all those things.
So so the Augie of Augie's Counter is one of your grandmothers who, like, I think all of our family on that side, she's not from the Salamon, but on the Salamon side of the equation, almost everybody was from the Carpathian Mountain region. We say Hungarian, even though they grew up in Czechoslovakia and Romania and God knows where else, but it is Hungarian Jewish and a Holocaust survivor. And I know for my generation, which is your father's and mother's generation, that means one thing. We were first generation, you're second generation in America and all of that good stuff. So I have the first question I'd like to ask related to that, because I know for my own kids, it's definitely different than it was for me. How did the Holocaust and how did just knowing that this was part of your family background affect you growing up? And even now, I mean, what role does that history, what has it played in your development as a person?
Yeah, well, I knew my grandfather, who I call Papa Steve, or as some family members knew him as Pichu. I knew his survival story from a very early age. I went to a Jewish day school for about 5-6 years of my life, and I remember every couple of years he would come in and he would talk. We'd had like a Holocaust week where grandparents and survivors would come and tell their stories. So it was very much instilled in my brain, and it was something I was very well aware of from an early age, and also my grandmother Augie's story as well, and your family, your parents, everyone. It was just something that always was kind of talked about. So I think I know the ins and outs of it, and it's made me proud in a way. I mean, it's obviously proud to be Jewish, proud grandson, to know that sort of determination and strength, is the same, runs through my veins. And so I've always kind of, I think both my grandparents, my Papa Steve and Grandma Augie, they built a new life here, as did many others. They ran a dry cleaning business and were successful and had 2 kids. And that kind of entrepreneurship and perseverance is something that I aspire to. And I mean, clearly. So yeah, it certainly has been an important part of my story, and it's important for me to know my background and where I come from, and those people's stories, because it's just better built me into the person I am today.
So it's interesting, I thought a lot about your focus on Hungarian cuisine. We were talking before the Zoom began that you feature probably the largest collection in the restaurant of Hungarian wines of a restaurant in this area, or probably in the country for that matter. And and yet obviously the Jewish relationship to Hungary is a complicated one, right? I mean, I was brought up listening to my parents speak Hungarian, but the Hungarians were collaborators with the Nazis. And so it's and there's a very right-wing government there now. And so it's always been a kind of complicated relationship. And yet this is the cuisine that you have focused on, is the Hungarian, even though I will say, having eaten your food, I frankly think it's a lot better than a lot of the traditional Hungarian cuisine. I mean, it's like a lot of modern cuisines and American versions of these cuisines. You've, melded it with a lot of other things. So tell me really about how you decided to focus on Hungarian cuisine. I know you've been to Hungary, and I'd love for you to talk about that. But what was it that made you zero in on that particular kind of cooking, and then how you've done what you've done with it?
Yeah, well, I guess there's a long answer and a short answer.
Well, tell us the long answer. We've still got time.
Okay, so growing up, I would have Sunday dinners at Grandma Aggie's house and at my other grandmother's house. Also, I have employees walking behind me. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. We know we're in the kitchen.
Yeah. And there would always be, it was always a mixture of Hungarian food and also American food, and sometimes Hungarian food that was Americanized. It'd be like, eggplant parmesan next to paprikash. It was like a full identity crisis happening on the table. And it was just but that was normal to me and my brother and my cousin Lauren. And as I got older and more interested in cooking, I think I was really enamored with the, Emeril Lagasse's of the world and the Rachel Rays and the Jadas. And I kind of moved away from that. And it was also, I mean, as you mentioned, my grandfather and my grandmother, more so my grandfather, weren't really big into talk, even though my grandfather would talk about his Holocaust story, and they didn't really share a lot about Hungary because of the relationship that they have with it. And, my grandfather was very bitter about the Hungarians turning on the Jews. And so it wasn't something that we really talked about. And it wasn't until after my grandfather passed away that actually my grandmother went back to Hungary for the very first time, after 2005, I think it was. So there was a lot of conflict. And so as I got older, it just, the idea of Hungarian food just kind of faded into the background for me. But it wasn't until I got, when I was working here in New York, that a chef had told me to pursue my roots, figure out the cuisine because I was questioning myself in terms of what kind of chef I wanted to be and what kind of food I wanted to make, and how do you figure that out? And so,
where were you working at the time?
I was working at a restaurant called Prune, which has since closed. That was in East Village, and so the chef had told me to just start with cookbooks. So, which of course, I love cookbooks, and I had a lot, but I went to the Strand bookstore, which maybe some are familiar with, near Union Square. And I went to the cookbook section and found on the little cart that's in the cookbook section that are half price or basically free, a copy of The Cuisine of Hungary, which was written by a famous restaurateur named George Lang, who owned a Café des Artistes on the Upper West Side. And I had never seen any cookbook mention Hungarian cuisine. So I just poured through it. And the first 300 pages are an extensive history of Hungarian food and how it came to be, which is very niche, very specific. And I was just really blown away that there was this really rich history and so many influences over this war-stricken country. And I didn't know that Hungarian food included so many nuts and fruits and torts and cakes and meats. And there was just this, if you peeled back the layers, there was just this really beautiful cuisine and this really fantastic story. So figured, why not bring that into the 21st century and make it approachable for the American palate, for my generation? Because while goulash is delicious, I don't really feel like eating goulash in the middle of July when it's 100 degrees. And there's more to it than just goulash. And so, and you know, pivoting a little bit, the food that we make here at Hagi's is in no way, shape, or form authentic or traditional, but it is more inspired by the ingredients of Hungary and Eastern Europe and my Jewish background. So you can kind of stretch those things and make new dishes out of it and introduce people to the cuisine in a new way. So yeah, wow, that was a long question, a long answer. Sorry.
No, but it's fascinating because look, I think the food at Augie's Counter is really delicious, but I also think one of the reasons it's gotten so much attention because it's different. I think, we have a lot of it. We have a lot of every kind of restaurant in New York City, but I was talking with you beforehand that I remember as a kid coming here to visit from Ohio with my parents. And of course, even though we ate Hungarian Jewish food at home, when we came here, we went to Hungarian restaurants.
Yeah.
And there were quite a few of them in the 70s and 60s. And, that world or those restaurants have basically vanished. And so I think that the idea that you've chosen to reinvigorate it is really caught a lot of attention because of that. And I was wondering, did you go to Hungary to meet with chefs there or to talk about, is there a whole foodie world there now like there is here? And have you connected with that?
Yeah, there's a really big food scene over there. But in ways, it's funny because I think, folks who live in big cities and are maybe a little bit more accustomed to foodie scenes would probably go there and be like, this food is like from 2010. Like they're still like catching up a little bit on the trend. But I had originally gone to, I've been to Hungary multiple times. I went when I was little with my brother and my mother and my father. And then I went back as like in my late teens to spend some early 20s to get to know it better and to spend more time with my family. And I got to see not just Budapest, which is the main city, but also the countryside and get more in touch with what else exists in Hungary, because most people just know Hungary and then it's Budapest. That's really it. And so I went to just expand my horizons and get to know the food a little bit better. Over there, they're really into Michelin stars, as is most of Europe. So it's like every restaurant that you're going to, they'll be like, well, does it have a Michelin star? And I usually never know. And that's not something that matters to me personally, but that's like a big thing over there. And they are taking the cuisine and they themselves are also trying to push it forward and modernize it. So it's not like an uncommon idea. Like I'm not doing something, even though it looks like I'm doing something new here by incorporating, it's definitely something that they're playing with and working with on a daily basis. And I've been fortunate enough to make friends with a prominent cookbook author in Hungary. And she herself is always looking for new ways to push the boundaries of Hungarian cuisine and incorporate all these other influences. So yeah, it's a whole other world over there. And I definitely recommend not just traveling to Hungary, but really like taking a car and like going around like the Northwest or the maybe staying away from maybe like the Northeast and going to the South and really just exploring it, because it's so beautiful and it's so influenced by all these, because it's landlocked, so it's really influenced by all these other countries.
So do you speak Hungarian at all?
No. I know a lot of like fragmented words. I can pick up on sentences, but it's a very difficult language. It's tough.
It is.
My father spoke, like, would speak pretty much fluent Hungarian to my uncle, his brother, and because my grandparents would speak it in front of them growing up, so it's probably a lot easier. But yeah, I could never retain it. It's really hard.
Yeah, no, same here. I've never learned it because my family was in Ohio, away from all the relatives. So all my cousins, like your dad, spoke Hungarian, but not us.
Yeah.
So I have to say, when you came to me, and I think it's almost, is it 2 years ago that you were first thinking about opening a restaurant? And it was it was during the beginning of the pandemic. And I have to say, I was both completely awestruck by your ambition.
Yeah.
And I was also worried.
Yeah.
Because I thought, what in the world is he thinking? And I think I was totally supportive of the idea, but it was really hard to imagine. And I have to say, you did it. And so I guess the question is, what gave you the chutzpah to dare to dream something like that? And just what was the process? I mean, I think this is now going to the sort of business part. I mean, you've told us how you learned to be a chef, but this is a whole other enterprise. I mean, just and even what size and where to do it, and what was the thought process that you went through? Because I think a lot of people have a fantasy of opening a restaurant, but what was the actual reality, especially, during the height of the worldwide pandemic?
Yeah. I mean, the kitschy, whimsical answers. I had a dream, and which is true, and it's always been my dream to open up a restaurant. I mean, no one saw the pandemic coming, and I never really imagined when the time came to open up my restaurant that I would be doing it in the middle of that. And yeah, I mean, I've always moved at a million miles per hour. My parents will tell you, and it's I don't know what came over me. I mean, Augie's counter has always been the restaurant has always been brewing in my head, and the concept. And I've been I kept a folder of notes and what I would do and how I would do it, because there's no book on how to open up a restaurant. Even there are. I do, and I've bought them. I do not recommend them. It is, and somebody should really consider, writing like a real book on it, but it's different for everybody, based on where you are, how much money you have, there's so many different factors. I can tell you that I have, yes, while I'm a chef and I had that leg up on the situation, it certainly was not knowing much of what I was doing, but a little bit of fake it till you make it. But fortunately, I was told once that opening up a restaurant, much like raising a child, takes a village, and that holds true. And you just have to find your village. You have to find the people that are gonna take countless phone calls and are gonna listen to you even when it is crazy, and which you have to be a little crazy to do this. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with being a little crazy. But yeah, I just have a really great village of people, friends and family that said, well, Jeremy's going to do this, and that,
He
period,
did it.
full stop. And
well,
we'll help him get
it
there.
is great. So I've just gotten the 5-minute warning, and I have a bunch more questions, but I did want to go. Somebody in the Q&A had asked whether, we've talked a lot about the Hungarian side of your family in terms of cooking, but you obviously were influenced by Arlene, and you said that she came from a Sephardic Jewish background. Have you ever looked at that kind of cuisine as something you're interested in exploring, or is it just so different that it's?
Yeah, I think my passion lies in the Eastern European realm, but I have been exposed to a lot of the Sephardic cooking growing up, and you know, I haven't dabbled with it too much to speak on it, but sure. I mean, I had a lot of spanakopita and like farmer's cheese and tomatoes and a lot of feta, you know. So Nana Arlene definitely her cooking was inspired by that.
So, so I guess if you had to, in a nutshell, sort of say what was the biggest change in yourself from going from being a chef to being a chef owner? What is the thing that you've had to, what's the personal quality you've had to develop the most to make that transition?
Yeah, I think I get this from, I'm not going to say which parent, but I get this from one of my parents, to be, you know, a people pleaser. And I always want to make sure that everyone's happy and take care of everybody. And I've had to come to terms with the fact that, like, as an owner, and I think this is maybe for any business, that you're not going to please everybody. At the end of the day, you have to do what's right and best for your business. And everyone that's going to work for you is going to have different perspectives, and that's okay. And you can learn from that. And that's an exciting thing. But I think at the end of the day, I've had to, you know, shift that perspective and be okay with the fact that I'm not going to please everybody. And I'm not going to be this, not always going to be the angel to everybody. And that's okay. It's a part of growing up. It's part of learning these things. So that's, I think, the biggest shift, and something I'm currently working on. So yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a great answer. And I guess before we tune off, you are working on a cookbook. What is going to be the theme of it? Is it going to be part memoir, or what is it going to be?
Yeah, so right now it's called Second Generation, but that name will probably switch. I have started working on it. It'll have some crossover with Augie's Counter recipes, but it's not the restaurant's cookbook. It's very much making Hungarian, Eastern European, Jewish food, modern, accessible, you know, for someone my age or any age to really like reconnect with their roots, but in this kind of fun, you know, young city goer kind of way. And yeah, it'll have some anecdotes about my upbringing and how I came to love this cuisine. Yeah.
That's great. So final question, about how many latkes do you think you're going to be making in this time period between now and the end of Hanukkah?
A lot. I think next week we'll pick up, we'll quadruple the amount that we're making. And I think right now we've definitely have passed the like 300 mark. So it's just, so a lot of oil and a lot of potatoes, and it's great. So.
And can you actually look at a latke right now without?
No, I usually will like make the latkes and then like I won't see it or touch it again until next year. So that's my relationship with latkes.
Okay. All right. Well, we have run out of time. This has really been fun, Jeremy. I'm really, really proud of you. It's incredible what you've accomplished. I think it is a dream. I hope you're in between all the hard work. I hope you're appreciating what a great accomplishment it is.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I, when you were introducing me before and you were listing all these things, I actually was like, really? It was a bit of a wow, okay moment. So thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.